Hi, let's introduce some fundamental concepts in geography. Okay, let's start here. If I had to tell you two things about geography as a field of study, probably the top two would be, number one, geography is the spatial science. It is a science of where things are located on the face of the earth. These can be things in the physical environment like rivers or trees, or it can be part of the human environment where different languages occur, where do different religions occur. And the second thing is that geography is an integrative science, that it integrates information from other fields of study. So to understand where trees are, we have to know something about their biology. We want to understand something about where different political systems are. We have to integrate information from, say, political science. And we tend to lump geography into two subsets. We tend to focus either on physical geography, which is the geography of the physical earth, its landforms, plants, climates, and so on, and cultural geography, or sometimes we call it human geography, which has to do with the human aspects of the world, population, language, political systems, and so on. And for each of these, and it's kind of a continuum, there's also something called environmental geography, which deals with both, but physical geography, to understand the physical world, we have to integrate. So that's where that integrative thing comes in, from other physical and life sciences to understand the distribution or where things are as in terms of the physical environment. And likewise with the human or cultural environment, we have different kinds of behavioral or economic or medical geography that integrate information from other fields of study like anthropology or medicine or history or what have you. And lastly, another thing we have in geography is the concept of regional geography. And regional geography integrates both cultural and human geography, physical and cultural or human geography to help understand different places in the world. So for example, world regional geography would look at the physical environment of the world and also the human environment to help understand different parts of the world. Okay, so just to re-highlight that first point, geography is the spatial science. It has to do with spatial relationships, where things are in relation to each other in space. And this is common to whether you're studying physical geography, economic geography, cultural geography, what have you, that this is common to all parts of geography. So whether you're a physical geographer or a human geographer, either of these people are going to be interested in space, how things occur over space. The difference between them is they're going to be studying different topics, either human or physical or economic or what have you. So how do we study where things are? There's a couple of ways of understanding spatial relationships. One is absolute location. This is a mathematical way of pinpointing where something is. And on the Earth, we have a system of mathematically pinpointing any location using a system called latitude and longitude. And so I'll give some examples. I'll come back and give some examples of that. But another way of understanding where things are is the concept of relative location. So Mexico, which is kind of down here, you can give some number. It has a latitude of 30, or 25, and maybe a longitude of whatever other number. But that doesn't really mean much to you. It's just a bunch of numbers. But if you understand that Mexico is bordering the United States, that's kind of a more meaningful way of understanding. So if you're studying, say, world geography, you really want to understand not just mathematically where things are, but where things are in relation to each other. It's more meaningful and a practical way of understanding. So an example I give when I teach in a physical classroom is there's two ways you can describe where I am in that classroom. You can measure my the number of feet from the door and from the blackboard. That'd be my absolute location in the classroom, a mathematical way of describing. But you could also describe me as being standing in front of the students. That is more of my relative location, because it's relative to the students in the classroom. So that's a more meaningful way of understanding where things are. So for example, the country of Singapore, it's a tiny island nation in Asia. It's right here at the tip of this peninsula. But it's a very wealthy and powerful country, not because it has gold or oil or anything else, but primarily because of its relative location in trade routes around the world that trade from South Asia to East Asia all pass through the Straits of Malacca where Singapore is. And so Singapore has benefited from its relative location in the world. Absolute location, the mathematical one, again, we use latitude and longitude. And I'll post some additional information with details on latitude and longitude. But basically, this is a set of angles. So at the equator here, this is 0 degrees because it's flat. And at the North Pole is at a 90-degree angle to the equator. So it's 90 degrees, and so maybe halfway to the poles, like here, would be, say, 45 degrees. East and west, we have longitude. And longitude is really a 360-degree circle around the Earth divided into two halves, 180 degrees east and 180 degrees west. Maybe a more practical way of looking at it is looking at a grid of latitude and longitude on the screen here. So if we look at, say, Oslo, Norway, it is around 60 degrees north and around 10 or 11 degrees east. London, England is about 52 degrees north and 0 degrees east or west. This 0 degrees here is called the prime meridian. It's not by accident that London, England is where the scientists who developed this system of latitude and longitude that we use were, and so they just kind of set that as the baseline for latitude and longitude. A couple of other just ways that we describe where things are. We talk about spatial distribution. That's really like the extent to where things are. And sometimes these overlap with each other. We can also talk about patterns. So how things are arranged in space. Are they clustered together? Are they spread apart? Do they occur randomly in the environment, or do they occur in some type of a uniform pattern? So maybe just to illustrate that, these are lights in the United States at night. And what they show you is where there are settlements. And so if you look at the eastern half of the US and the western half of the US, they have a different pattern. This is much more densely settled. There are a lot more small towns. And in the west, there are some big cities like Phoenix and Las Vegas, but there's also not that many settlements in between. And so as a geographer, if you're interested in this, what you may want to think about is how are these environments different? And as it turns out, in the east, it's much flatter and much wetter. So there's much more farmland in between the cities. And in the west, there's more mountains and desert. So it's much more sparsely populated in between the urban areas. So if you've ever driven to Las Vegas, for example, that gives you an idea of why, because you can drive for a long time and not see any towns or anything like that. And then lastly, the concept of spatial interaction. And what this means is that something that happens in one place has an impact somewhere else. So if the ocean gets warmer in the Pacific Ocean, that could affect rainfall patterns in Fresno, because that could affect how much evaporation happens and so on. So when we get an El Nino year, we get more rain because of changes out in the Pacific Ocean.